Okay, so in 54, we're talking about ecosystems, and we did talk about ecosystems previously. Now we're starting to talk about like the cycling of elements through them. So we're going to really hone in on the water cycle here, the nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So it's a pretty clean-cut chapter, but talking about how, in this case, this is pollution, which is a branch from what we had just spoke on, but that pollution is a whole lot of different elements that are not natural to this area. So what does this do to the life forms here? It kills them. It threatens them. Some of them may be strong enough to withstand it, but some not. As we talk about carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling and all of that, that brings us to a simple place, which is a food chain, which multiple food chains form a food web, which is where we're going to start here. We know that the ultimate source of energy for all life is the sun, okay? So it says here, the sunlight provides the energy input for practically all ecosystems, because every food chain has to have some type of producer in it at some point. But it mentions that primary productivity, that means what plants do, varies all over the earth. Does anyone know why primary productivity varies all over the earth? Okay. There might not be access to sun. Biodiversity. Are there areas where there are more plants than not? For sure. Okay, deforestation is definitely playing a part in that. Can you tell me where you think the primary productivity, the work of the plants, is the highest on Earth? Ocean? The work of the plants, primary productivity, where we get the most benefit from plants, where there's so many plants together they're working. The forest, yeah. Oceans, forests. Okay, good. Also in this, of course I'm going to answer your question, or my question in a second. I just want you to think for a second. We're also going to look at, because we're talking about food chains / webs, we're also going to look at how much energy is lost. And does anybody remember that number? 10%. Fantastic, but we'll get there. Okay? So food chains, food webs. A grazing food web starts with the producer, then you have an herbivore, and then you have a carnivore. We have trophic levels. So we have bottom, and then it increases as we move towards the top. Usually at the bottom of our trophic level, our energy pyramid, we have a producer that gets the most amount of energy. And then at the very top, we have some tertiary or quaternary consumer, so alpha organism in their food chain, that gets very little energy but has to eat a whole lot of food because they get very little energy. Because they have to eat so much food, what are they also at risk for? Pollution, which is called what? What's the biological magnification? Remember that. So you're at the top of the food chain, you get the least amount of energy, which is what we're about to talk about, least amount of energy, but most amount of pollution, exposure to pollution. Here it also mentions a detrital food web, and I believe this is the third time in our conversations that detritus has come up. What is detritus, or what's a detrivore? Dead or decaying. Yes, you consume dead or decaying matter. That it was once alive, but it has expired, and you're consuming it for its nutritional value to you. What are some examples of detrivores? Vultures. What else? Fungi? Earthworms. So there's what I don't want you to think is that it always has to be bacteria. Although bacteria are really good detrivores or decomposers here, you might detrivores may also be considered decomposers, not like a vulture, but fungi could be considered a decomposer. Bacteria could be considered a decomposer. Earthworms, are detrivores, so they're eating off of that as well. Maggots, such like that, okay? When we say terrestrial, what are we talking about? Land. So this is just your basic terrestrial food web, and this is what you should have kind of constructed, not necessarily this exact one, but for that lab. Starting off with the producer, moving up to a primary consumer, secondary, tertiary. It also shows detrivores, okay? And ultimately, it's showing that, like, oh, here's waste. That waste will be broken down and fed here. Like, it's not just one direct relationship, which would be a food chain. It's showing that there's multiple interacting aspects, which now makes it a food web. And when I teach this to ninth graders, I'm like, a food chain is just a bunch of food webs put together, and you're connecting in between them. So, and look at what the ultimate source of energy is here. The sun. And I love food webs that have the sun in it, because that just acknowledges the fact that energy is just transferred. It's not created or destroyed. It's just transferring forms. Solar energy. Of all the solar energy that we're exposed to, about only 1% is converted to chemical energy through photosynthesis. And that seems crazy to me, but indeed that's what our scientists have calculated. But this statement here, the second one, is something that came from 1406. It says primary producers manufacture 150 billion metric tons of new biological material per year. What is it that these primary producers manufacture? Glucose. Remember that plants or primary producers create carbohydrates. Glucose is a carbohydrate. And we had talked about that previously. So that's what it's saying here. These primary producers make a whole lot of glucose. And just so that we're on the same page as we're moving into 1407, and I did mention it in 06, but they don't just make glucose. Glucose is what we study because it's photosynthesis. And that's the process that we studied in 1406. But they can make starches. They can make nucleic acids, depending on where they are and the access to resources that they have. Okay? So all that's possible. They do quite a bit of work powered by the solar energy from the sun. Gross primary productivity is, by definition, the rate at which producers convert solar energy into chemical energy. I feel like that's just like an economic term. Like, it's primary productivity. What does it do? How fast can you take solar energy and turn it into chemical energy, to glucose, or to some type of biological molecule? Okay? The reality is that although they take a lot of that energy and turn it into food, they use some of the energy for their own processes, like cellular respiration. Okay? And do they use 100% of the energy they get? No, remember? They can use 10% and the other is lost as heat, right? Okay, and then some just remains open in that ecosystem. Here, I had mentioned this in the previous lecture, limiting factors. Make yourself familiar with limiting factors, especially as we speak on ecosystems. A limiting factor is anything that will limit the size of a population. A limiting factor is anything that will limit the size of a population. Availability of sunlight will limit the size of a population. Why? If they're producers and there's not a lot of sunlight, guess what they're not going to do very well? Photosynthesize. Yeah, for sure. Okay? Another limiting factor is water. You may have all the sunshine in the world, but you don't have any water. What's the problem here? Photosynthesis requires water. It's a limiting factor. But even if we're not talking about plants, is water a limiting factor for you and I? For sure. Okay, so the term is limiting factor, anything that limits the size of a population. So we're talking about food and water here. Temperature is a limiting factor. If it's too cold, some organisms can't live there. If it's too hot, some organisms can't live there. Is protection a limiting factor? Like homes and shelters, for sure. You and I have these exact same limiting factors, but you know what kind of drops these barriers for us? How much money you have. Why so? Because we all need a home. But the more money you have, the fancier your home. So money starts to become like we compete for shelter, but the degree of our shelter, but that's putting humans on it. Okay? We also compete for mates. We compete just like these other organisms, but we've put another little emotional / economic value to it. Do you want somebody who refuses to go to work or go to school or better their life in any way? To me, that's a limiting factor. No, thank you. Just because I wouldn't even want that type of person around my offspring, lest them have that genetic material. Okay? So being educated, gainfully employed, these are things the ways that you and I overcome our limiting factors. Here it mentions how much photosynthetic tissue is present. We didn't cover this in 06 because we covered it in 07, but not every part of the plant carries out photosynthesis. What is the photosynthetic organ of a plant? Leaves. Leaves. But we'll get there. Okay? So coming to my question on which area has the highest primary productivity rate? It's the ocean. By a small margin. By a small margin. Followed up by the savanna. So this is the primary productivity rate. Or not this, I straight said this. It's the tropical rainforest. I knew you had said you said forests. So we have different forests here, but look, still their primary productivity is semi-high. The marine ecosystems is usually what blows people away. But what is it that's in marine life that's photosynthetic? Plankton. Plankton. And they're everywhere because they're the main food source for the smaller organisms there. And plankton are protist, and they're autotrophic. Autotrophic means they make their own food, and they're photoautotrophs, which means they use sunlight to do so. So their primary productivity is high, followed up by the tropical rainforest, which is no surprise. And then here you have your deciduous, your temperate forest, etc. What was I going to say? You don't have to know, that's not going to be a test question. It's just cool to know. And so, Jacqueline, yes, you are right. The ocean has the highest net productivity rate. Secondary productivity. This is the energy that the organisms who consume those plants get. So secondary productivity. So if you eat that plant, how much energy you get. We already know, and we just had this conversation, that 10% is what that organism takes in and uses, and the other 90% is lost as heat. Okay, and that's what it's saying here. So some energy is used for maintenance and locomotion, and the rest is lost during heat transfer or during transfers as heat. Ecological efficiencies. Overall, I believe for the human species alone, our as far as our efficiency, metabolic efficiency, I think we're at 32%. We are not very efficient. Our bodies are not efficient. As a species, we are not efficient. So if you're thinking of some how can I make a huge impact? Figure out a way that we can utilize more of what we have, because we're just a wasted resource, in my opinion. Some of us more so than others, but that was rude. But your ecological efficiency can range anywhere from 5 to 20%, and this is not talking about a single species. Like I said, a single organism. Ecological, we're talking about a whole ecosystem. Okay, that's a food web, food chain. That's all those different aspects. I'm just talking about as our metabolic rate as a species when I said that, 30-ish%. 10% is transferred to the next trophic level, so that trophic levels are primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary, and so on, and detrivore. Okay? Depending on what you have access to determines how differentiated your food webs are, your food chains are. we had talked about when we were in lab that the tropical rainforest, everybody always thinks that there's like some crazy awesome, and there's some crazy awesome things there. There's a lot of plants there. But do plants eat plants? No. So you're really limited when you come down to organisms within a food chain. And I bet if you pick the tropical rainforest, there's a lot of insects or small, like, there's not like this big main predator. Like you don't have this crazy lion that's been roaming the open lands because there's no open lands and there's nowhere for it to hide or area. So your food chains are different than those that would be in a savanna or a grassland. Okay, here's the nutrient cycling. So when we talk about ecology, the study of ecosystems, we talk about the study of both abiotic and biotic factors. So here are the abiotic factors that contribute to an ecosystem. So the hydrologic cycle is going to be the water cycle. Carbon cycle is the cycle of carbon throughout that ecosystem. Nitrogen cycle, the cycle of nitrogen through that ecosystem. Phosphorus, cycle of phosphorus. Why did we pick water, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle? Those are the elements found in highest abundance in living organisms. Water has hydrogen and oxygen. Carbon, we already know if it's organic, it has to have carbon. Nitrogen is found in proteins and nucleic acids, and phosphorus found in nucleic acids. These are the elements found in highest abundance in living organisms. That's why they're here. Not just randomly did we pick this stuff, just so you understand the application. And I am not by any means saying I feel like you already know this, but the cycle of water, like I'm just going to show you a picture. This has got to be very similar to what you saw in school. Like the water evaporates because of the heat, it holds itself in a cloud, and then guess what happens? It rains. And if it rains over the ocean, it just goes straight into a sink, like the ocean is a sink. But then we have the weather that may bring some of the rain onto land, and it might not exactly dump right into the ocean, but over time it's going to make its way back to a large body of water. Whether it sinks into the ground and travels deep, or whether it runs off of a mountain, or whatever is there, it's the water cycle. Like, and it's considered a cycle because, yeah, it's a cycle. Like, it just keeps going. Like, nobody's like, oh, I'm going to hold all the water. That's not a thing. Okay, so the water cycle. So maybe I oversimplified that, but I truly feel like you're like, oh, okay. Like, it's the water cycle. The carbon cycle. In 1407, I said the carbon cycle is really not to Lion King it, but it's the circle of life. Because all living organisms have carbon, right? And so a food chain is a really good example of an aspect of a carbon cycle. Now, just because it has carbon, does that mean it's organic? No, but everything organic has carbon, okay? But like coal is not necessarily organic, okay? And it has carbon. But the carbon cycle is the cycling of carbon dioxide, of carbon in general, through an ecosystem. And it talks about it being in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. A lot of the plants will take in that carbon dioxide, but what do? We get rid of it. That's a waste product for us. So as fast as the plants are taking it in and using it as a resource for food, you and I are exhaling and replenishing that resource. The largest reservoir of carbon is in sedimentary rock. Okay, so it's where it's sunk down or it's begin forming layers, and you'll see that. This, another diagram, like straight out the text. But you can see it's saying here, like within these marine food, and it says food chains and food webs on both parts of these. Okay, this one's more aquatic, and the next one is more terrestrial, the next picture. But these food webs, death, sedimentation, like their feces, all that stuff will sink down. All that has carbon, right? And then we pull fossil fuels for that. It's saying sedimentation. Then we have bicarbonate. So these are just different buffers, different forms of carbon, not just carbon in its pure form. We will harvest some of it and use it to make fuels and use it for its energy purposes. mentions here, like photosynthesis is taking carbon in, then we're releasing oxygen. Like, it's just the movement of carbon throughout an entire ecosystem. Again, if it's living, it's considered organic, it has carbon. But just because it has carbon does not mean it is living. But all living organisms, the element found in largest abundance in all life is carbon, followed up by hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then phosphorus. Here you can see it in a terrestrial ecosystem. And just so you know, like, it was one large picture, but it's just in two. Anyways, look, we have this little dead guy here. Like, it's showing you that that's what that is. So there's your whole circle of life. Here we have some human impact, some fire. We have some rain over there. We have some combustible fuels. We have some volcanoes. I mean, this is a really cool place to visit. There's a lot going on here. But you can see all the different food chains and food webs, the potential for them at least. You can't see all the organisms. But you can see just the constant cycling of carbon. The nitrogen cycle is the cycling of nitrogen throughout the ecosystem. Big picture on this. Nitrogen in its pure form is toxic. So if we need it, we have to get it. But it's toxic in its pure form. It has to be broken down, or what we will end up calling fixed. It's called nitrogen fixation, so that we as living organisms can utilize it. You see nitrogen fixation, ammonification. So ammonia, you're going to see ammonia in the nitrogen cycle. Denitrification, nitrification. We're cycling nitrogen. All living organisms need nitrogen. It is part of proteins and nucleic acids. But look at who does the work here. Bacteria. So when I teach this to my 9th graders, so I talk the carbon cycle, I'm like, it's a circle of life. Food chains, food webs, you can kind of see all that kind of stuff. When I say nitrogen cycle, this stuff is happening underground. It's bacteria are doing this work. Bacteria are doing this work. The nitrogen cycle is being carried out by bacteria. And here's a diagram. There's animations embedded in these, of course, that you're welcome to click on. But look at where all of the work is taking place. Underground, where there's a lot of bacteria there to break down the process they call it is nitrogen fixation. And there's different forms of it, and you don't have to know all that. You just have to know the general cycle of these nutrients through an ecosystem. But the bacteria do all the work, break it down, make the soil, make the nitrogen more abundant in the soil. The plants use it, and then who eats the plants? Herbivores, other organisms. And that nitrogen then cycles up through it. So all of this hard work is carried out by bacteria. So nitrogen cycle made possible by bacteria. The phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus usually catches itself. We can find the largest sources of that in sediment and rock. And when we want to release phosphorus, it's usually taken care of by weathering or erosion. So we break down the rock and it releases that phosphorus into that area, usually to the water, a water source. So phosphorus naturally puts itself in sediments like layers of rocks, and then the weathering, the movement, the erosion of that stuff will make that phosphorus available. Another good diagram, just showing the cycling of phosphorus. And all of these use very similar ecosystems. What you need to understand is we intentionally looked at certain elements. We didn't just say we were looking at a food chain or a food web, although they all play into each of these. We're looking at the cycling of hydrogen. We're looking at the cycling of oxygen, which is water, the hydrologic cycle. We looked at the cycling of carbon, which is the most abundant element in living organisms, which is the carbon cycle. Nitrogen cycling, carried out mostly by bacteria. And then the phosphorus cycle. These are the 5 most abundant elements in living organisms, which is why we covered them in ecosystems and because we're studying biology. Okay, it's the same, just missing all the arrows, and they changed the font. Here is a focus story that you need to make sure that you're familiar with from your text. Okay, so any questions here? All right.